I'm Eric Chemi, and this is Politely Pushy. John, thanks for joining me here on the podcast. I'm really excited to chat with you today because you've done so much. You've done world famous, I'm not going to call them stunts, but world famous work, or, that people still recognize. They talk about, like the vertical football, all the work for Adidas going back many years. I appreciate the fact that you went to UC Santa Barbara. That's where my sister went. And we joked. I went to MIT. So I was the dork and she was the normal kid who got to live on the beach and party and have a nice life. So I'm jealous of your livelihood and the way you got there as a surf bum that made it this far. And I can see the nice greenery in the background there in your nice background here. So thanks for coming on the show with me today.
No, a pleasure. I was have you ever heard of something called the Hash House Harriers? It's something in Asia. And these guys, they were runners, but they called themselves drinkers with a running problem. Okay. And it was a great sort of mob. I guess I'd be a surfer with an advertising problem, not the other way around.
Well, I know when we got this scheduled, you emailed, said, it's possible the surf will be too good and you might forget. And this podcast might not happen. So how often are you still surfing every day?
Well, I mean, if the waves are on, we had one of the best summers. Hawaii had one of the best summers in probably 15, 20 years. And then it's been a really, really kind of strange winter so far. So I should be on the North Shore right now, but it's only sort of 2 to 3 foot and kind of windy and not so good. So it's your timing with this podcast is perfect.
You've been serving for a long time, longer than I've been alive, I think, according to when I look at the Wall Street Journal article, it called you, this was more than 10 years ago, the Don Draper of Asia, right? That's very high praise. We'll get into that. But you've been surfing, they say here, from 1980. And that's when you get to Asia. So you must have been surfing even before that.
Oh, yeah. No, I was born in San Francisco, and I started sort of midwinter San Francisco one day. A friend of mine had a surf magazine. I was a skier, actually. I started really early at 6 years old skiing, and then surfing was about 13 years old. And a friend had he'd been to Hawaii and he brought back some surf mags, and you just see these pictures of Hawaii, and it's beautiful and it's warm and it's hot. And it's just lovely and everything. And I went out my first time midwinter San Francisco. We didn't even have wetsuits. We had what's called a dry suit, which was just really kind of gnarly and stuff. And my board, I had a board I bought for $5. It used to fill up. It had hollow inside. It used to fill up with water. It was a nightmare, but I dug it. And that's why I went to Santa Barbara. I'd never been to Santa Barbara before, but I knew it was, there was a wave right sort of where the campus is and stuff, and never looked back. It was fantastic.
I want to get into a little bit of the background of the path, right? The surfing idea. You've, like this article said, you were basically down to your last dollar, right? Begging for food. And then eventually you were, okay, I'll be in Japan. I'll make some money. I'll teach English. I'll teach shorthand, right? Like you not like set out to say, I'm going to have this career in advertising. I'm going to work my way up the corporate ladder. I'm going to study all the right things and do all the things that, it's like all the success books tell everyone that you're supposed to do. You took this in a very different path. That's what I'm interested in, because I'm curious, as a kid, when you were surfing all the time, right? My guess is you're not hitting the books every day, right? Like, do you have the parents looking at you say, hey, what are you going to do with yourself? I'm curious about that parental pressure, that societal pressure of you need to fit in this box, and you didn't, but yet you still came out on top regardless of that.
Well, it was interesting because I've been on my own since 17 in terms of, I put myself through school and stuff. And I was working about 30 to 35 hours a week in restaurants in Santa Barbara, putting myself through school. And it was one of these things where I remember professors used to say, it's a shame that you didn't turn this paper in on time, because it's one of the best papers we've read so far, but I've got to mark you down because you were a week late. And that always seemed to be the habit. But it's where I started to write and stuff. And that's really what it was. But I left the States in 1980. I had saved up probably about 8 or 9 months before I finished school. I'd finished paying off school, saved up $7,000. And I thought I was going to be gone for a year. And $7,000 lasted me 2 years and 9 months. And I must say, it was a pretty feral existence. When you have local Indonesians really sort of taking pity on you and sort of coming up and giving you some food because they're going, who is this guy? Why is he just hanging out on the beach?
Right. What's this American guy doing here who doesn't have a job?
No, exactly. But, I mean, it was such a beautiful time. I spent a lot of time, and most of that was in sort of Sumatra and Bali and stuff, and surfing places that hadn't been surfed, particularly in Sumatra. Was sort of some of the first few years that it had ever been surfed. Bali back in that day was incredible. It was magic. Little island off Bali called Lombok, where there's an amazing wave called Desert Point. A friend and I literally were in a little lean-to kind of thing that we constructed for about, I'd say 3 months. And as soon as boats would come with surfers, we'd swim out to the boat and sort of say, "Got any extra food? Got any extra food?" And the surf was just firing. It was wonderful. It was great. And then I ended up in Japan. I sort of had a couple $100 left to my name. I knew a girl. Her brother was my roommate 1 year in Santa Barbara at a house. And her parents, her mom was Japanese living in the States. Dad was American living in Japan. They had divorced. And I hung out with them for a while and then got a job first teaching English. And then I got a job teaching shorthand. I didn't know shorthand, but I kind of bullshitted my way in. And back in those days, bullshit could get you a job, but it couldn't keep you a job. It could get you in the door, but then you have to sort of prove yourself. And that's sort of the way I fell into advertising, because I started working for a small copy shop. In those days, you had art houses and copy shops in Tokyo. And basically it was...
Describe what a copy shop is to someone who hasn't been to Tokyo.
Well, a copy shop is literally, you're the writer, and we're in Japan, so obviously, why would they need an English writer in Japan? Well, back in those days, the Toshibas and the Minoltas and cameras and all what they called OA, office automation, they needed manuals and they needed things written in English for their sort of overseas audiences and markets and stuff, and we did that, and then this small copy shop said, "Look, we're opening up a little creative shop. We'd love you to be the writer." And that's how I got into sort of more mainstream. I met a guy in Tokyo, and he worked for a big agency called McCann Erickson, which
Can I pause before we get to the McCann Erickson part? Like, you mentioned the college paper, like, "Hey, I wish you had turned this in on time because this is a really good paper." Where did that skill come from, that creativity, that ability to express yourself? Was that God-given talent, or was that something that you had been nurturing as a youngster?
I'm not sure if it's talent. I've worked with a couple people who I consider unbelievably talented, and I just try hard. So when I see work that's fantastic, and I go, I'll never achieve that kind of level and stuff, so I better work hard and this kind of thing. But no, I really like to tell stories. I mean, that's really what it's all about, is just storytelling. And I could write, and it came kind of easy and stuff. And even these kind of dry manuals for office automation, if you liven them up just a little bit and make them a bit more human, you get a reaction. Certainly I got a reaction from the people who were sort of supervising the project and stuff. And it seemed to go down well. And when they opened their little creative shop, that was where you got to do things that sort of were a little bit, I guess it was just a little bit more interesting and stuff. And then I met this guy who worked for McCann Erickson, and he goes, and I was talking to him, and we met actually in a liquor store in Japan. And the only Japanese I knew at the time was how to order a case of beer from the liquor store. So I helped him out. We went back to his house, ended up drinking sort of half of it, kind of thing, became fast friends. And he was the one that said, "Look, you'll go twice as far in half the time in a place like Singapore or Hong Kong as you would if you went back to the States," kind of thing.
True.
And I didn't want to necessarily go back to the States. Singapore's really close to Bali. I've got friends in Bali. Yeah, I'll try Singapore. So he got me in with McCann Erickson, and it was.
But how much of this was a path for you, or was this just a job so that I can keep paying to serve?
There you go. That's my whole. To be honest, that's kind of every decision I've made. If I had a decision between really good surf and really little money, or better money but no surf, I take the former over the latter pretty much any time. The only thing I did do is, when I wanted to work with places, I wanted to work at places that were doing the best work in whatever, because I've worked in in Singapore. I've worked in Jakarta. I've worked in Hong Kong. I've worked in Tokyo. I wanted to work in the places that were sort of the best. And actually, you did a podcast here one time with a guy named Chris Matistic.
Yeah, Chris Matistic. Yeah.
Yeah, we worked together over 30 years ago at Adidas and Singapore. So this is the kind of people you and Chris. I think we reached out to each other about a year ago or so, and I know he's been writing for sort of tech kind of stuff.
Right, his sort of tech humor, creative storytelling, and he's another. That's true. It's interesting you connected so long ago because he's got that similar vibe of I'm doing my own thing. I'm not part of anyone's system. I'm creative. He's so creative like you in ways that I could never come up with these ideas. I appreciate when I see him, but I know I could never have come up with them myself.
Well, his partner his art director was a guy named Merrick. And I remember Chris and Merrick, there's about 6 or 7 teams. We worked at this place called Adidas, and it was the hottest sort of creative shop at the time in Singapore. We did the advertising for Singapore Airlines, Singapore Tourist Promotion Board, Tiger Beer, a bunch of things. But, you'd have 6 or 7 teams, and you go into one of the rooms where the team is, and you see the work that they just sort of are producing, and you go, damn, that's really brilliant stuff. So you go back in your room with your partner, you lock the door for a couple of days, and you wouldn't come out until you have something that you thought was as good, if not better, kind of thing. And that's really what it was. It was that kind of desire to sort of not let the side down, I guess is the way to describe it.
How did you get to the top then? Where does it go from like, I'm just in, I'm in, now I'm running the show. It's my ideas. I'm leading a team. Was that a sudden chance that somebody took on you, or was that just years and years of, okay, now I'm just this is my industry, this is my business, and I'm doing a little bit of the rat race here?
Well, it's interesting because I worked for this company called Beatty Ads, and we had some clients, and one was a client called Singapore Technologies, where the client was actually, she's now the Prime Minister's wife. Her name is Ho Ching. And Saatchi, another agency, had also done some work for them, and we had this kind of powwow where their agency and our agency were presenting some work together, and the sort of CEO and creative director of Saatchi's saw me present some of the work we had done and this kind of thing. And she said, look, she called me up a couple of weeks later and said, we've got an opening for a creative director in Jakarta. Would you like to do it? And at that time, Jakarta was like, I mean, it was sort of where I guess creatives went to kind of be put out to pasture and this kind of thing. It wasn't sort of a really kind of vibrant market. But so I asked some friends and they said, oh man, don't touch it with a barge pole kind of thing. But I go, you know what? It gets me even closer to Bali, right? It's a 45-minute flight. All right, I'll take it on. And it was really interesting because when I got there, I didn't realize, but most creative directors there were all on the tape. 10% of any production budget for any, TV commercials and this kind of thing went into the creative director's bank account. I thought that was just madness. I thought, no, man, let's make it. And they were all crap. They were just really, really crap commercials. So I didn't want to play that game. I wanted to do some nice stuff. We ended up winning the first bronze lion ever for Indonesia. And I quickly got a reputation of not playing the kind of game that all the older creative directors were playing. But we ended up doing a lot of good work. And Saatchi's at the time had hired David Droga to be the sort of regional creative director for Asia Pacific. And David was, I mean, he's one of the guys that I consider, unbelievably talented. I over my career, I've worked with Dave Droga, who's 10 years younger than me, Lee Clow, who's 10 years older than me, and John Hunt, who's just a few years older. And these three, I really consider people of unusual, extraordinary talent. I mean, it's intuitive. They have more talent in their fingernail, I think, than I've got in my entire body. And it's really interesting. You absorb from these guys. And Dave was the one that he liked what I did in Jakarta. And then he brought me up to Saatchi's in Hong Kong. And that's started that kind of thing.
What was the culture shift like? Culture clash, I'd say, when it's obvious you're not from Asia Pacific, right? And you're in these, maybe you're doing things a different way. How much of this was the old guard saying, this guy's not from here, right? He's a foreigner. We don't want to listen to his approach and he needs to just go back home at this point.
Well, no, to be honest, there was at the time, and this is sort of 80s, early 90s kind of thing. At the time, it was the kind of thing where a lot of the creative departments did have foreign creative directors, or they did have, you know, sort of really hot creative teams who were foreign. Obviously, there are some unbelievably good local teams as well, but it was a mixture kind of thing. And there were some markets at the time where you went out to, like I say, you know, end your career, and Jakarta and Sri Lanka and a few others were certainly like that. But I just wanted a different thing. I wanted to do well. And to me, doing well was doing the kind of work that gets noticed, you know. It's something that's what spurred me on. I mean, I was in the business for a long time, but I really can't stand advertising in terms of most of the advertising you see, whether you see it in any exposure. I really don't like it, but I love great ads. So I don't like 99% of the dross, but I love that 1% that just moves you, that, you know, that whatever it was, it just really reckons with you. I remember this great print ad done by DDB in London. It was called Volkswagen Cops. And it was this print ad. And I saw it in What Car magazine for the first time. It was the double page spread. And you had these two big cop cars on the street, but all the cops who are obviously, there was something going on, they're all hiding behind the Volkswagen Polo, because it's you know, small but strong kind of thing. And it was so beautifully done. It captured a zeitgeist of America and this kind of thing. It's just, you know, really good advertising moves you. It can really sort of make an impression.
What percentage? Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, what percentage of the ads that you've helped put out there would you say are in that 1%? Would you say your own ratio is 99 and 1? Are there things that you've put out where you're just like, I have to get this done because it's work, but I myself wouldn't actually want to see this or consume this?
If I was really honest, I'd say maybe, if I'm lucky, I was 98 and 2% okay. Stuff an hour, maybe 3 if I'm sort of being generous to myself.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when you mentioned sort of Adidas and this kind of thing, it was the kind of stuff I didn't want to make advertising. I wanted to make news. And if you do stuff that actually makes news, and that vertical football ended up getting, I think, sort of over $200 million of free publicity for the client. We followed it up with an impossible sprint when we launched this tagline globally called "Impossible is Nothing," where we put on the side of a building in Hong Kong and the side of a building in Osaka 100-meter tracks. And I didn't know how high 100 meters was. I knew it was 100 meters, but that's like 32 stories. And we had people, this is over the Olympics in 2004. During the 3 weekends of the Olympics, we had people, you know, it was called jugging. It's sort of like a way you climb your rope kind of thing. And on these tracks on the side of the building. And even when there was nobody running on those weekends, the fact that the track is on the side of a building, it's 32 stories. The one in Hong Kong was on the Swire building, which is fantastic. It was right in central, absolutely, you know, all the cameras and everything were there. And people were actually, you know, with that stuff, people were trying to, they'd call up the agency and say, or they call up the client and say, when are you guys doing that running again? Or when are you doing that vertical football again? They were making bookings to go see an advertisement. And when you have that kind of thing, then all of a sudden you're part of the world. You know, you're not part of the advertising. So insular. And
right.
We like to pat ourselves on the back with all these award shows and this kind of thing. And I know of few other industries that do that, apart from maybe Hollywood or something like that.
I think advertising wants to be Hollywood. They feel like they're adjacent, but they're like, no, we want to be in there. We're equal to you, but it's like, hey, you're not quite.
Well, it's funny because I worked with Zack Snyder one time on a shampoo commercial, of all things. And Zack Snyder's now this big kind of Hollywood-y type guy. He was a commercials director before. And, you know, they would never even admit to selling themselves with commercials and this kind of thing. Whereas if you know, we just, I don't think it was for us. It wasn't so much trying to be Hollywood, but I think you're so right on that. It was just, we wanted to do things that actually made a dent, made an impact, got people talking and this kind of thing. And I think if you set out to make advertising, a lot of times you're going to make these kind of bog standard boring ads. And let's face it, no one's really, you know, no one just sits there waiting for your ad kind of thing. Although I was disappointed, for example, in this year's Super Bowl. I watched the Super Bowl for the first time in about over 20 years, sat through the whole thing, and the advertising was pretty much very ordinary. And I was very disappointed. The game, you know, I sort of watch more proper football than American football, but it was one of those things that was a real disappointment. So I don't know. I think the space that people are, there's this playground where the online and where the digital and the real world meets, and I think that's kind of a more interesting place to play. But I think more than anything, how do you stand out? How do you get that your brand's recognized in this kind of thing?
So much to unpack there. So first of all, you didn't watch the Super Bowl for 20 years. I'm curious about that, given that it's become this advertising event. Why did you just decide, I don't even want to pretend like I'm aware of what's happening here. I don't want to be part of this.
In Hawaii, so I've been living in Hawaii now, coming up to 10 years. In Hawaii, it's because it's the best day to surf when there's good surf, because everybody's home watching the Super Bowl.
Okay.
So that's one thing. And prior to that, I'd be in Asia. And because I spent sort of 38 years in Asia kind of thing. So the time difference was just something where it was just never, then. But you're right. And the thing is, there always is a collection of those Super Bowl ads after the fact. Now it's become before the fact. Right. Even, but there is that after the fact. So I always watch that. And there were some, again, speaking of Lee Clow and Chiat Day and Apple and stuff, TBWA, 1984 was just that amazing commercial that I absolutely adore that spot. I think it still stands up today. And the fact that it ran once, the fact that it only ran once, to me is quite amazing, because it certainly ran so many other times as people were just watching it and repeating it and this kind of thing. It took on a life. And there's been some fantastic Super Bowl ads over the years, but I don't know. I think it seems to be a bit of a dying art.
It's probably still that 1%, like you said, right? Yeah. The 1% that we talk about generally, I think that same percentage may apply even on that same night, despite all the money and effort that's put into it.
Yeah, I'll be diplomatic. Maybe I missed out some of them because a certain percentage of the commercials they then give to Hawaii for local Hawaii. So when some bigger spot was running on the mainland in Hawaii, we were looking at some local construction guy down the street who's advertising and this kind of thing. It was quite charming. It was quite funny.
Yeah, maybe you missed it. We'll leave it at that. Maybe you missed the good one.
Exactly. Maybe I did.
The current world, right? 2023, very different than when you started out.
Yeah.
And you said it's also saturated. Everyone's trying to make news now with their ad. Like that was maybe more innovative at the time, but now everyone's doing it. Everyone's in your face. Everyone's trying to cross over to the real world, and they're trying to be part of the real world and not just the advertising world. But do you think people are just tuning all this out, right? Everything's an ad now. You can't trust, is this content real? Is this an ad? Is this person who's, a social media influencer? Is it all ad? Like everything to me feels like I'm bombarded with an ad, when maybe before I would have been more naive and not realize that.
Well, I think it's even deeper than that. I think, in your 30, 40 years ago, you were not assaulted. You maybe would have 200 to 300 brands that you would run across during the course of your day, whether it's walking to work or commute, right, whatever. As you say, there's so much saturation. That's now up to something like 5,000 to 8,000 brands are competing for any sort of eyeball attention in the course of one day that you're spending, going from wherever you are to wherever you're going, how you're spending your day. And I think you just absolutely, as everyone should, you just tune it all out because it's noise. It's not speaking to me in a way that, I really love things where they're not doing it for themselves. They're doing it for others. It's somebody once said that I admire the people who plant a seed for a tree that's going to grow, the shade of which they'll never sit under. And I think it's a beautiful sort of concept of doing something that's more than just, trying to get an impact in the next 15 minutes. I think the whole thing of, and I'm probably going to open up a can of worms here, but I think the whole way that we're geared towards Wall Street, and every company has to show their next quarter's numbers, and that beats the next quarter's numbers and all this kind of stuff. To me, it's a race to the bottom as they're trying to race to the top. I don't see how that's a sustainable thing. I mean, I'm very naive in that way, but I just think that this, looking at everybody so mindful of their and marketers come in, the CMO has, a nanosecond to make an impact. If they doesn't make an impact and it's not moving the stock prices, the CEO the same way, their compensation is going way up. The average person's compensation is not moving at all. system's broken, man. And I unfortunately, I don't know what a possible fix might be. And I'm sorry, I'm getting off track here, but back to your thing. I just think we are so deluged by brands and logos and at the very smallest kind of thing. And then all the noise and this, and people are tuning it out. People just tune it out.
Is there a point to be made, though, despite that we think we're tuning it out, we're trying to tune it out, the brand is still getting in there. It's pernicious enough, it's subtle enough, it's osmosis. As long as they're in front of our eyeballs, they're getting their job done, whether we like the spot or not, whether we like whether it's a magazine, a newspaper, social media, TV, radio, however we consume it, 99% of it we don't like, but maybe it's still moving their bottom line, right? If you're that CMO, that CEO, like just do it, flood them because it drives sales.
Yeah, and I think that's, probably the people who are doing it better. They experiment in a lot of different sort of areas, and they try, you experiment with absolutely different sort of ways in, different communication delivery vehicles, and see which ones proves a bit sticky. You talked about influencers and this kind of thing. I mean, and product placement, we can all spot that stuff. Everybody has a very good sort of antenna. And they can spot when they're trying to be sold things they shouldn't sell, and when it's not authentic. I think authenticity, when you have a combination of innovation and authenticity, is quite amazing. I mean, if you look at the brands that consistently do it well, and I think, for example, probably my favorite brand in the world is because it's not about the advertising, is Patagonia. I love everything about Patagonia. I love their products. I love their ethos. I love the fact that Yves Chenard has made sure that the company will forever be owned by not for profit kind of profiteers kind of thing, but by the people. Everything about it. And then when you get down to the way they advertise, the way they market, the relationships they build with athletes or whoever are their ambassadors and this kind of thing, I think Patagonia to me is a shining star, and I wish there were so many more companies. I think Apple's done a brilliant job over the years with Apple. I think there's a consistency there. I got to see it quite close up because I was the sort of regional guy for TBWA in Asia Pacific, but I'd go over to sort of LA and be with Lee and be with his team and see the stuff that they're doing before it was out and this kind of thing. It was fantastic. But there's few Patagonias out there, and there needs to be more. To me, it's something. He really, as a CEO, as a founder, he's really walked the walk the whole way. It really is wonderful.
And you contrast that with the world of Facebook and Google and how we're being tracked, and cookies, and advertising is just a means to an end to run our lives, basically.
Well, it's funny because I worked for Google for 5 years, and Google. I'm
in-house or on the client, like were they your client or you worked in-house for Google?
Oh, no, I was their chief creative officer for Google in Asia Pacific.
Okay.
And we had teams I was originally based in Tokyo and then based in Singapore, and I had teams in Tokyo, Singapore, and Sydney. And we were basically a value add for customers that were going to spend a lot of money. They would say, hey, we've got this kind of creative team, creative hotshot kind of thing within us, and they'd love to do some stuff. And we did some really, really innovative, very, very interesting stuff. And Google, I must say, coming from agency life and this kind of thing, where you're swimming with sharks all the time, I must say, I swam with dolphins for 5 years, and I only met 2 sharks the entire time I was with Google. And that was such a it was such a wonderful thing. And
not what people would expect.
Yeah, and to be honest, just as last week, a couple of my team are part of this 12,000 that got let go, and it was really, really shitty the way they did it. And I was so shocked that Google, Google has an expression of being googly. There's their way of doing things, and then originally Sergey and Larry were very famous for saying "do no evil." There was some evil being done the way people were let go, and it was very ungoogly. I mean, look, it's Sundar Pichai is an amazing guy. He makes a couple $100 million a year. Take that couple $100 million for 1 year. Take your 1 year salary and distribute to the 12,000 people who you've let go, and that shows the world that people are important and this kind of thing. If I'm making $200 million a year, I can do 1 year. I can But wouldn't that have been an amazing thing? Wouldn't that just be amazing if he did that? People would just, because when I was with Google, it was constantly considered the best place in the world to work. It was always being voted. I don't think it is like that anymore. And it makes me sad because I loved Google. And I still have a lot of time for the people that work.
Are there companies that you look to, like you mentioned Patagonia, other companies that you admire? It's harder to find those in the tech sphere right now because there's so much of a downturn, and you're seeing the rougher sides of their behavior, right? You're seeing what Google can be when put a gun to its head. So are there companies that you admire because they've toughed it out? You mentioned Apple, but other ones that maybe are under the radar?
You know, that is a good question. And I don't know, because unfortunately, I think it's easier to sort of remember the ones that you don't sort of necessarily, I mean,
it's actually the opposite of advertising in this sense, right? Advertising, the bad ads you forget because they're boring to go away. The good ones, the 1% you remember. But from this point of view, the PR side of it, it's the bad guys you remember. You actually more likely to remember the bad guys than the good ones.
I'm not a big fan of Mark Zuckerberg, not as a human being, but just as an ethos and as a business kind of thing. And if I owned Instagram and I knew that Instagram was helping young, vulnerable girls commit suicide because of the bullying and the pressure, I would do something radical to how could I live with myself if that kind of behavior is going on? It absolutely, it really has, it's something that I think there's a lot of moral fiber that has just, it's dissolved. It's dissolved. And this kind of thing. And that's why I get back to, you know, I'm trying to think of right now of other companies. And I know there are other companies out there, and there are smaller, you know, if you look at the companies that are getting into things like meat alternatives, you get companies that are working with sort of alternative energy and this kind of thing. There are smaller companies that are really, they want to do the right thing, and they are doing the right thing. We don't hear about them enough, but hopefully the ones that, you know, we will. But I think it's just, we need to get away from that whole Wall Street mind. You know, I think everything is based not on, you know, long-term growth that benefits the communities that they operate in, but it's short-term growth that benefits the CEO or the board of directors or the share prices. And I don't know how we get around that. You know, having lived outside of America for so long, you get to see your country, you know, without blinders on and this kind of thing. The gun laws in this country, I'll never, ever understand. You know, in Singapore, you get caught with a bullet, automatic, you're in jail. One bullet.
Just a bullet in your pocket.
In bullet.
Even if there's no gun.
Yeah. I lived in Japan. I mean, Japan, you know, when unfortunately Abe was assassinated last year, but the guy had to make his own gun and it could shoot one bullet and this kind of thing. And then you talk about the medical thing here. Again, it's just unbelievable in terms of, so the gun thing is, it just blows me away. And you know, I don't know why people don't understand that a well-regulated militia was back in the days where you had a musket and you had to put your ball in, and you had to put your gunpowder in, and you had to, you know, it was 5 minutes between each shot and this kind of thing. That was, even then
everybody had that. That would be a different story.
Yeah.
Right. Shoot once if you need to.
Yeah. And it just kills me because, you know, if you look at John Stewart was the other day, and by the way, that's a brand I quite like. I do like John Stewart, and I do think he's been a really good human being for a lot of the things he's done. But he was talking to this Republican guy, and he was just saying, you know, for the number one cause of death for young people in this country is firearms, whether they're committing suicide or whether they're the victims of some sort of criminal behavior or whatever. I mean, and yet they're concerned about drag races, or I mean, you know, drag shows or whatever. It blows me away. Florida and Texas, you know, don't get me started. Just don't get me started.
But they might have surfing there.
Yeah, actually, they do in both places. But you know, and one of the best surfers of all time, many people consider him the best surfer of all time, came from Florida. I think Cocoa Beach, Florida, and stuff, where the waves are small and the fish are big with big teeth and this kind of thing. But it was, yeah, it's just one of those things. I'm not a big fan. I'm just not a big fan.
The difference between Asia and the US, there's so many differences in terms of culture, how you market, what people want to see, what they respond to. But one that comes up as you started mentioning politics a little bit. TikTok, right? It's an Asian import into America. Such a phenomenon, right? In terms of what it can do for brands, what it can do for advertisers, but concerns, right? Political concerns. What's your view on TikTok and its influence in terms of how advertisers and brands can use it, and maybe what they're concerned about if, hey, this thing goes away, what we're doing? Because the Instagram thing with the young girls you talked about reminded me too of some of the dangers that TikTok also has. It's not just Instagram.
Very much so. And I think the other layer you add on to that is, all right, so who's farming the information of that, who's getting that information, that personal information, and will it ever be used for nefarious purposes? Who knows? It sounds to me like, that TikTok doesn't have the brightest future in the world from a regulatory point of view. I don't know about these things, but it just seems like the writing might be on the wall. But that there will be another replacement to that. I think more than anything is, social media has amazing things. We all acknowledge the convenience, the whatever, and this kind of thing of social media. But there's a dark side and a downside to social media. And I don't know, it brings out the best of humanity and brings out the worst of humanity. And the worst of humanity is pretty bad. It's pretty bad, particularly in America. And it's a shame, because I just, back to this thing about the people who are influencing your children. If somebody, and the whole transgender thing and this kind of thing, my only view on that is this: if I have a child and they're considering the ultimate sort of sacrifice in terms of suicide because they don't feel comfortable in their gender, I would do anything I could to make that child feel comfortable so they don't commit suicide. That's the thing that matters to me. And I think that's getting lost in a lot of this kind of whatever. I mean, yeah, there's things, and we need, the pendulum shifts one way and it needs to shift back to the other way. And then we'll find out, hopefully, a better area. But certainly when it comes to the arguments that people are making with some of these things, I think they're getting it really, really wrong, and they're using it as a political tool or a point scoring tool as opposed to anything meaningful. And I think when you look at countries like Scandinavian countries and stuff and how they deal with issues, it's really about what's best for the community, what's best for the public as a whole, not what's best for these special interests who have loud voices.
How have you shifted your career, right, in this sort of Hawaii stage, now that you're no longer in Asia exactly and you're in Hawaii? How have you shifted? Because, like you said, there's so many more negatives out there, right? Everyone's got an ability to get their voice and opinion out there. It dilutes what brands were trying to do because they're not the only people who can broadcast their message now. So how have you shifted your advice, your approach, how you're helping companies? Because the job is different now, right? Because a company is competing against anybody on social media now that can get their story out there, that can get their messaging out there.
Yeah. And I think, look, I've started a company with a wonderful group of people. It's a Singapore-based company, so I still have my hands very much, and it's called WOM Global. And WOM simply stands for word of mouth. That's the oldest form of advertising.
I was wondering what that WOM stood for. Now I know.
That's word of mouth, okay? And that's the oldest form of advertising. It's the original mobile phone was your mouth and this kind of thing. But one of the things that's really important is, again, call it a Patagonia shift. We want to do things where we can actually make a dent. So we want to work with clients, and we are working with clients that have got a larger purpose, that have got the environmental devastation that's going on in the back of their minds, and they're adjusting their whole supply chain accordingly and this kind of thing. We want to work, and we're working with like-minded folks that whatever we do, how can we do it in a way where our footprint is as small as it possibly can be? We look at the entire value chain, the entire supply chain, see where we can make a difference and this kind of thing. And yeah, we worked recently with a wonderful sort of, candle maker of all things. One of the scented candles and stuff, but they're using Latin American artists to get that artwork on their candle vases and stuff out there. to a far bigger audience than the artist would ever have. And it's wonderful because it's an Asia-based sort of company that they're getting exposed to Colombian, Venezuelan, Mexican, all these amazing artists from Latin America. And there's this cross-cultural thing going on, which is really kind of cool. And they're called Artitude Home. And it's interesting. And, I guess having spent nearly 40 years, a lot of times selling things that people really don't need, we just want to work on things. At least I want to work on things where, you know what, it's doing the right thing and working, it's hard. It's hard to do the right thing all the time. But if we can do well by doing good, we're going to do good first. And then hopefully we might do well.
What's an example of trying to sell somebody something they don't need? What comes to mind when you said that?
Sugar water. I can't believe that people, 7-Eleven have these giant or whatever, have these just sugar water. I mean, the whole, I know fast food, it's just something. I worked at a McDonald's for 4 days when I was 16 years old in San Francisco. And I've never been in a McDonald's since then.
Really?
And we actually had the client at TBW. We had the client in China, and I had to supervise a shoot. And this is in the wintertime. It's snowing outside. And I'm sitting in the producer's van outside, going to the window, looking inside the McDonald's and stuff, because I phoned up my kids. I said, I just want to let you guys know that, I'm sticking to my guns on this one. I'm not even going inside. And they're going, Dad, you're an idiot. Just get warm.
Like, I'll freeze to death out here, but I'm not going inside.
And the client was lovely, but they again, it's junk food, sugar water, that stuff, tobacco. I refused. And when I was in Indonesia, we had a company would take on, they wanted us to pitch for, it was called Japan American Tobacco, Japan American Tobacco. And I absolutely refused. And I got my kind of knuckles wrapped by the higher ups in the network and stuff. And I said, guys, I've got a couple babies now, man. It was when I was starting a family and stuff. And how could I, sell cigarettes and this kind of thing. So
for the sugar water and the fast food, you would take on the client, but you'd have a little bit of an arm's
well, I didn't take on the client. They asked me to help out.
Okay. The client was already there and you had to kind of.
The client was already there. But again, the thing about a network is we had the business in China, but we didn't have it anywhere else.
Right.
I'm in charge creatively of the region, and the China business they saw me giving a speech. They said, get him over to help out or else the business is going to walk, kind of thing. So yeah.
Those are tricky things to balance because you're trying to
tricky things.
weigh your own employees and colleagues and your own team and doing right by them too.
Very much so. And the thing is, for me, tobacco was a line in the sand that if they said, no, you have to do it or we're going to let you go, I was ready to say, I'm sorry, it's too much. Let me go.
Right.
So, but you're right. It's how much are you willing to compromise a lot of times? And I think that's probably one of the interesting things about what we're doing now is we don't want to compromise our values. And the nice thing, and one of the great things about this amazing online world and this kind of thing is companies can't hide. If they're doing bad things, people will find out that they are doing bad things. So I think more decisions on brands are being made by what does that brand stand for? What is it really sort of doing? Not greenwashing. I mean, look at the petroleum companies. Look at BP after the disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, trying to spin their way out of it and this kind of thing. Chevron, what Chevron's been doing in South America is dreadful and stuff. And I think you can't hide. You better, if you're not changing the fundamental flaws in your whatever, in your product or in the way it's delivered or the way it's sourced, if you're not changing those fundamental flaws, you better soon, because it needs to.
What do you tell younger people coming out of college, the UCSB graduate of 2023 who's asking advice for like, hey, I want to be you one day. I want to be in advertising. What is your advice for this up and coming generation?
Well, look, great. I still think I love being, and one of the things I always wanted to do was surround myself with young talent. So we were always mentoring young talent because they're not varnished. They have no sort of filters yet. They haven't had those built-in filters that come from swimming with sharks and this kind of thing. The advice I would give them is try to be great. I mean, look at the stuff. Best advice I could do is, in whatever business you're in. So let's say you're into PR and you're working for PR agencies. Find the best PR agency you possibly can and work with them. I really love this team at Bospar. I think they're really good. I like what they're doing. And this is not meant to be a plug, but I just like their orientation. And I think it's right. I think it's really, really good. I like that. Find people that you think are, find companies that are really the kind of companies you want to work with, and then do whatever it takes to get in. Just do whatever it takes to get in. I mean, it's like I say, that it's so much harder these days. But yeah, and then once you're in, it's very simple. You got to be the best. And if you're not,
hold on. It's very simple. You just have to be the best. Well, I laugh a little because the advice is simple, but yet so difficult.
What I was going to say is, so, you know, the naturally talented, the really, you know, intrinsically talented human beings, they are there. Okay. I'm not one of them. I had to work my rear end off by working harder than anybody else. I mean, when I remember our first child was born in Singapore, I was going into the office. So I was going into the office at 6 a.m. for 2 hours. 8 to 9 was visiting hours in the morning, go visit my newborn child, work all day. 6 to 8 p.m. was visiting hours at the hospital. And then from 9 to 11, I was back in the office because it was a big pitch this week. And I was doing that for 5 days while my infant was in. I mean, I don't recommend it, but that's how I didn't have the natural talent, so I had to compensate with hard work to get me to where I needed to get to.
It's amazing how many people I've talked to recently have said that same thing. Like from the outside, we look at them and think they must be naturally talented, God-given gifts. And they'll all say, no, I just worked a ton of hours. I just put in a lot of effort. It's not just a gift.
And I was lucky because at least I'm working on something, you know, every once in a while. You know, Lee Cloud, a great expression. He goes, every once in a while you get something through the nincompoop forest. And when you get something through the nincompoop forest, man, it really feels good. And those nincompoops can be people you work with at your own agency, or it can be the client, it can be whatever. But it's so much easier to say no than to say yes when you're looking at an idea on a piece of paper and it's not formed. It's not truly formed yet. It's just easier. It's just easier. So I think one of the things was, you know, when you have a chance to get that one or two first things through the nincompoop forest, and your peers are telling us that's really kind of good work. That's kind of the nice thing is, you know, the problem with brands a lot of times is they want to tell the world we're great. No, it doesn't work that way. If you are great, let me tell you you're great. Don't, you know, Patagonia doesn't go out there and say we're the best,
right?
Whatever. They just act the right way, and if they've got a product that they think can make it better, they'll make it better. It might take a couple of years, but they'll make it better. They're doing great. They're not saying great. And I think that's the thing is that you know, when you have a little bit of a taste where somebody has come up to you and said, I really like that, whatever you did, whether it was an ad or, you know, TV commercial or whatever, I really like that. I think it inspired me. Man, that's one of the best feelings in the world. And then you want to recreate that feeling, you know, and the small hot shops, the reason they're good is they recreate that feeling more often than others, you know, and this kind of thing. I'm not into fast food, but I loved Burger King when Burger King was at Crispin Porter Boguski because the ads were so hilarious. It was just, you know, the Whopper freak out where these guys go into a little one outlet and there's no more Whopper. It was just beautiful. It was just beautiful.
That was certainly that whole era. That era of Burger King ads. Those were good. I agree. They blew me away. My wife and I, we went one time to a really sketchy one in a bad part of town. Look, I just need to go. The ads. I gotta go. I gotta have one. I gotta just get this urge out. And then we went there. We're like, you know what? I think the ads are better than the food in this case.
I'm sure.
And then we did. That was it. Then it was over. Like, I'm good. I don't need this anymore.
Yeah, it still didn't get me in the door, but it made me smile every time. And I really look forward to it. And that's it. When you can look forward to something. I mean, people were calling our agency up and saying, when are those guys going to be playing football down at Shibuya? You know, and it was 5 times a day for 15 minutes a time, you know, at 10, 11, 12, 1, 2 kind of thing. And when people are calling you up trying to make a reservation to go see your advertising, that's when you know you kind of done something that is not too bad. Is not too bad.
John, this has been great. I really appreciate the time. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing some of these stories.
Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to my guest, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to get the latest episodes each week, and we'll see you next time.